It's good to see everybody. Got to see some of you guys earlier today. It's really my pleasure to be here to introduce Candida today for talks. I'm going to read her bio here officially. Candida Alvarez is widely regarded as one of her generation's most highly innovative and experimental painters. Her work has been collected by the Art Institute of Chicago, the Museum of Contemporary Art Chicago, Whitney Museum, San Jose Museum of Art, and Museo del Barrio, among many others. She was granted the Trellis Art Fund Award, Arts and Letters Award in Art by the American Academy of Arts and Letters, Mellon Foundation Latinx Artist Fellowship, Helen Frankenthaler Award for Painting, and the Joan Foundation Painters and Sculptors Award. Alvarez is an alum of the Yale School of Art, and she held the F.H. Sellers Professorship in Painting at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, where she is now Professor Emeritus. In the fall of 2024, Alvarez was the Alex Katz Chair in Painting at the Cooper Union. Her career-spanning solo exhibition at Museo del Barrio, titled Circle Point Hoop, was on view this past year until August. It was an amazing show. And her recent show, Real Monsters in Bold Colors, Bob Thompson and Candida Alvarez, just closed at Gray, New York, right? A few months ago. Okay. She's represented by Monique Maloche Gallery and Gray, New York. I've known Candida for many years and known of her work for many more before that. Candida has been a mentor to many of my friends who got to study with her in Chicago. And is one of my favorite painters, so I'm really, really delighted that she's here. And we both got to show together in a really important exhibition a few years back at the Whitney Museum called No Existe un Mundo Post-Huracán. There does not exist a post-hurricane world, which was the first exhibition of contemporary Puerto Rican art ever at the Whitney Museum. It was a groundbreaking show. I was really proud to be in community with Candida, and I'm very, very proud that you're here with us today at SVA. So welcome and thank you.
Hi, can you all hear me? Yeah, okay. I am so delighted to be here, and really the legacy of this school, the professors, the teaching, the learning, it's always an honor really to be in the community and to be part of it. And to sort of go back to a little bit about Guerrero, Marcela, who was one of the first Puerto Rican curators at the Whitney. You know, she always talked about the show as like, we never get over the hurricane, like that idea of being in a hurricane state. And we're still in that hurricane state. And so what do we do with all that wind and all that dust? And, you know, how do we as a community hold ourselves together? So thank you for inviting me so I can sort of share with you some moments in my life. It's always, I guess being the age that I am right now, it's been several years in, so I am so grateful that I can still share. So what I decided to do was put the presentation, I sort of circled around several shows that I had, some solo shows, starting with some of the more recent ones. But in the meantime, I want to just give you some background, some context. We all start somewhere. We all have beginning points. You're not just born to say, I'm going to be an artist. I think it's kind of something that grabs you. It takes hold of you. You're like, what? What's that word? Artist? Oh, but now I think they call it creatives, right? I think it's like, am I an artist or am I creative or I'm all of it, right? And so, but the courage that it takes to take that on and to take it on honestly and passionately it's a lot. It's a lot. And so we can't do this without community and with other people who come before us. And so this is Jack Minton with me here, and he was one of my first painting teachers. And he passed not too long ago, but he was so dedicated and he was so interesting. He was a painter, but he was a painter who used many different things. And so I think that's where I got my permission from, they say, I'm an experimental painter and I can do whatever, but basically I'm an artist who loves color and whatever form it takes, I'm in. I'm all in. So Jack was like that. He was like a wizard, and we got to go to his studio. He was working on glass. He was sculpting these beautiful pieces out of wood. He had a home in Greece with his wife and family, so he had both these locations as inspiration. And he was really just so dedicated, and it was a beautiful show. And I think it's still up at MoMA, and finished. And it was extraordinary, right? Because he painted, but he did prints, and he had his own way of sort of creating texture, and used his own tools, right? Anyway, so this was a little drawing that I found. I was getting ready to participate in the show at a museo, and I'm just sort of over that right now. And this is what I would call the period of sort of re-examination. So this is like my first lecture since my show's just closed. And so I haven't been really public lately. I've been really low key. And so, yeah, so we need that, right? We need to regenerate as artists, and to really reconsider. And so for me to have these huge shows with all this press it was like a hurricane, and it was very, what can I say about that? I learned so much more about myself on some level. And I was reminded of a lot of the things that I cared about. So here's this little drawing that was also in the show, and it was put in at the very last minute. And what I noticed is that there's some of the angles, there's that angularity, there's a way of working that I still use today. And when you're starting, if you could save some of those early references, they can be very helpful later on. And Bearden was somebody that I discovered very early around the same time. And it was after I graduated from Fordham, and I didn't go to get an MFA yet. I didn't know I wanted to do that yet. But instead I found out about this institution called Museo del Barrio, where I just had this retrospective. So they've been around for a long time, and they had these wonderful classes. And I took a few of them. There was a ceramics class, there was a printmaking class. Bill Toulis was teaching there from Pratt. And his wife was also there. I can't remember her name. I think it's Gladys. I can't really remember her name, but personally. But it was an invigorating environment, and there were art books. And one of the art books that was laying around was the Lord American. And to this day, I think, especially the way he collaged and the way he brought things together is something that I've always been very interested in. There's something about gathering. There's something about, it's almost like reporting on the things of the day, or it's a way to sort of be present. Another artist that I found was Francis Folliet, and I heard about him through a sale. There was a show. There was a big, huge painting. I think that was part of this big show that was put together with the Met many years ago. And as a consequence, I actually the painting that I remember seeing was the Wake, which is the painting right next to it. And it was fairly big. I mean, it was like 8 feet, about 13 feet. And I remember thinking, wow, I want to paint like that. I want to do something like that. And the theme here is the velorio, which is it's the death of a child, and this idea that when somebody dies, they don't just disappear. We celebrate their soul, like we celebrate something else. So it's sad, but it's also a celebration. And on the left is the little painting that I saw when I went to Paris. So I was in the Cedar Arts Project. I think it was just around that time. And it was one of the first projects that the city of New York supported for artists, where they gave us a salary. It was about 300 of us. It's never going to happen again, probably, but it was magical. And so there were about 350 artists in that project. And I met a lot of artists, Down Bay was one of them. Elizabeth, Mary's husband, the poet Bob Holman, you know, so I met Elizabeth through that. So there was Pedro Anthony, another poet. There was Ursula Fine Arts. Oh, Herman Cherry was in that. There was a lot of people. And it was another way of thinking about, you know, what an artist could be, what an artist could be like, because it was interdisciplinary, like this program, like all of you are not just from one department, right? You're a mix. And so that energy is so important to have. And so I went and I saved my money, went on this little trip to Paris to the Museo del Barrio. I believe this little painting was held and he was right next at that moment he was right next to Mona Lisa. So the two little paintings were next to each other. And there was a crowd of about 10 people, there was a plexiglass, but it's not like today where Mona Lisa just commands the whole space. So I just want to say how important this was. And as I look at it today, a few years later, I noticed that there's the woman who's sewing this black cloth, working on the black cloth. And years later, I started to also use black deer napkins and black, just big broadcloths to create these drawings, which I'm not going to show you today because they're really hard to see. They were hard to see in the exhibition. So we're going to let that go. And then I was lucky to be at PS1. And again, these things happen almost by chance. I don't know. I was the Cedar Arts Project. There was a woman there, Michelle Feinstein, who was an artist, and she told me about this place. And because I lived in Long Island City, I happened to be living in, well, actually, I lived in Flushing, Queens. There was this, like a space for an artist from Queens to have a space. That institution is still alive, right? And but in those days, they had a lot of artists from international locations. They were from all over the world. They had studios there, and the country supported that. So it was very vibrant and very different. And this auditorium, which is now really fancy, I mean, you don't even realize how it's just this big gallery space. And I created my very first, I would say, installation, and I was painting, but I wasn't painting. I wanted to paint on this floating surface, right? So it was just a piece of canvas, and I had a very small studio, and I used fabric from vintage stores, and I was very interested in sort of working with figuration, but sort of pushing it a little further, and so it became more symbolic, or more metaphorical and weird. And so I used I would trace bodies, like my mother's body. Had somebody trace mine as a beginning point, and then I put this into this archway. And then I lit it with a piece of fabric, which was called scrim, which is used in theater. And I wanted to create like this watery element. So this was like my sort of very early ambition to do something outside of studio. And then again, being in the Cedar Arts Project and having this community led me to other people. And of course, Dave Hammonds was friends with a lot of people in that program, and especially as I called my unhusband, the father of my son, Mr. Bay. I was very privileged to sort of meet so many other artists, and to David was a very close friend, and was kind of like his unofficial official photographer at the time. So we followed him around. He would follow him around mostly, but here I was. This is me in the middle with the beaver hat on, and I totally related to David because he wore beaver hats too, and I love beaver hats. So that's me, and we were there with his snowball action. And that action, was very fascinating to me, that he would even sell them, right? And people actually, I guess he sold them for a quarter. It was just kind of to be a young artist, and to be in the middle of all these conversations and all these thought waves that were not just pictorial, but they were sculptural, and they were performative, and they were casual, and they were somewhat political, right? I mean, this idea of selling these no laws, is kind of ironic in a way, and weird. And the guy who's sitting, the yellow jacket, we don't know him, but they were also selling stuff there. So he was kind of listening in, trying to figure out what this guy was doing, like you say, selling souls, I don't know what the guy was selling, so selling fruit, I don't know. It was cute. It was a really fun day. It was cold. It's fun. All right, so let's go on. I'm not gonna talk too much about all this work, but I want you to ask me questions. I think that's how this all gets more interesting, right? But that made a movement. I wanted to show this early on because as you begin to do your work and as you begin to explore a pathway into the work, as you begin to consider what's important and how do I even, why do this? Like, why bother? There are different entry points or different portals into sort of building a narrative for yourself. Building sort of pathways that make sense. And one of the ways is to begin to think about, events that occurred in your life. That maybe can add something to what you're trying to figure out today. And so I would invite you to not push away memory, but actually invite it in, because it's an important resource in the future from now. And so there was a moment when I started thinking about that, and I was thinking about my mother, and I was thinking about how she had these odd little things. Like she would say, "Dame un número," give me a number. And she had her own system for recollection. She had her own system for sort of remembering people. And I don't know where she learned that from. Maybe her mother, I'm not sure, but that's what she would say periodically when she felt like somebody was trying to reach her. It was kind of like a telephone system for her, but so she would say, dame un número, and I would say, okay, 4. She would say, okay, cuatro, A, B, C, D. Okay, and then she would start thinking about friends, family that started with the letter D, right? And then it would be like it's just a little weird sort of twitching that happens, I don't know. But that's a form of communication, right? And for some that's weird, but for some other people it's life, And so I would take something like that and try to use it. And so this is sort of me remembering her in some weird way. It's kind of cartoonish in a way, but there's also the stacking on the top, which has these X's, because I love to sew into like hard materials too. And so there was a lot of cutting up. And so in many ways, it's sort of similar to multiple windows, in the projects where I grew up, like these 14-story buildings. And there's a lot of material there that I would collect. And it's this sort of abstracted way to deal with something that's very sonic and performative, but yet, how does it relay back into an action that's Victorian? That makes sense. And I like using more than one panel sometimes, so that additive process was also cool. Okay, so a few years later, I'm at Yale, and again, this idea of bringing what is part of you with you, because you can't get rid of it really. But then you start to notice things. I like looking around the room and seeing, well, what's available. So when you walk into a new space, sometimes people leave things behind. So that becomes a resource, right? So you can throw it out or you can use it. So I found some scraps of wood laying around and I started. So this was one of the first pieces that I did. And so the pennies goes back to my father. He did this other thing where he would toss pennies in the air for them. And so it was an old habit, they were born and raised in Puerto Rico mountains. And then they emigrated to New York, because, well, my father was in the Korean War, and he was drafted first. Then he came back as a soldier. Luckily he didn't die, but he did get hurt. And then he met my mother. And so my mother she wanted to leave the island for work, to find work. And so she needed a chaperone. So my father chaperoned her. I think it was what was the first airplane? I want to say it was Eastern.
Houston.
Eastern, they went on the Eastern jet and they fell in love. But they weren't actually, they weren't related, right? So it's kind of this beautiful story, about how I can fall in love on an airplane ride. And then I'm glad they did, because now I was 4. So anyway, so there's something about tossing pennies for good luck, and there were a lot of pennies around the studio and in the main space. And I forget what that game is, when you flip the pennies, right? They were doing this. Then I wasn't into that, but I was really, I was like, oh, the pennies I could use. So that idea of the pennies, and then all these circles that were floating around, the circles that are on your tape dispenser, I just started to really hold on to shape as it's something that just was kind of cool and meaningful, but at the same time just fun to work with. And this idea of the penny going around and then connecting it sort of kind of forms this almost like a mechanical thing. Almost like, we used to play mousetrap games, right? Like that mousetrap they had to build, and then it was like this thing about the ball goes through. And, there's something about that that's very enchanting. Well, for me, as a kid, right? And there's a little son. I had a son too. My son is 34 right now. But then he was probably about 3 years old, 4 years old. And that's his little hand that I also copy, because I often love using a copier machine. I always have. Had this very weird relationship to it. But it's always breaking down, or something gets stopped, or whatever. But so it's always in my practice. All right. All right, so I wanted to start with one of the last shows that I had, and that was Bob Thompson. So Bob Thompson, again, somebody that I learned about when I was at Yale. I didn't know about this artist, but there was a woman there, Judith Wilson, who was getting her PhD on this artist named, Bob Thompson, and we were like, who is that? And that's how I started to learn about this guy and this artist. And over the years, you probably didn't see a lot of his work. But his colors were really strong, and he was African American, and he, did a lot of work with the Bible and biblical stories, but also, just these amazing sort of landscapes. And with animals and weird things, and you can only imagine that he died really young. I think he died in Paris, or was it Rome? I can't remember. Maybe it was Rome. And he hung around a lot of musicians in New York as well. So he's between, came back and forth, and so anyway, I was invited by Gray to do a show. They saw I had a little sort of image of him in my studio, and they asked me if I wanted to do this joint show with Bob Thompson. I hesitated, and I said, "Sure, okay, so let's go." And so this was the first one. So there's something about, again, this conversation between paintings or people or artists. How do we learn, like as painters, how do you learn about painting? Well, you have to look at other artists' work. You have to look at other paintings. And what does that mean? How do you deconstruct it? How do you find the things that are interesting? How do you remember them? How do you reuse them? How do you extend it? And how do you keep it interesting for us? If this is your chosen medium. For me, it's like calligraphy, it's like writing. And so for me, the idea of shape has a lot of meaning, and it comes from the world. In many ways, it's a way I sort of gather information about the world that I'm in. So I use a lot of references, and then I draw these things together. I put them all together in a drawing, and then they become a painting. So they're kind of complex. And the colors are mostly more intuitive. I'm feeling a yellow, I start with a yellow and then I go with it. And so I just wanted to go through the shell a little bit. And so the middle, the little tiny piece, you can see it, but it's a Thompson. That's how the scale, the scale is very tiny. And so I just started working with what I was looking at and deconstructing his work in a way and just playing with it and going back and forth, and ultimately I came up with 6 paintings. And I call them like see Bob too. Me, I'm seeing and then Bob, I'm seeing Bob. 2, and then there's 3. And I like going from big to little. This has kind of been my range in scale recently, the last couple of years, right? So they always like to include an image with somebody walking in a gallery for scale, right? So this painting actually was bigger than mine there. I mean, that particular painting is fantastic too. Very beautiful. I also did a series of drawings with these, but I didn't bring them with me. But there's the scale. And so curating the show was really easy. We had such a great time. Raven Mansell, who's the director of the gallery, Ray, and it took us maybe 20 minutes to put it all together. I just felt it was just magical, the whole thing. It was just like, okay, let's do this, do that. I don't know if any of you have gone to see the show, but it was up for a while. I mean, if you get a show in the show, it's up for 3 months, I think, right? And such enormous amount of press that, I never anticipated. So I just wanted to put this in as a way to sort of introduce this, but not to over speak it because, paintings I find paintings when they're represented in this form, they die a bit, right? There's nothing like being in front of a live painting. This is just different. It looks different every time you show it because the screen is different, the color is different. So, but this is a very early work. Again, there's a double painting, this double panel, and it has a little image. Soy Boricua's name of that. It's sort of a self-portrait. And this is another room. I've done a whole series of black pieces. And these are from the 80s, I believe. And then the other one on the left is the 90s. The bench, the cushion was created. It was based on one of the drawings in the show, which is very. And it was a beautiful looking gallery. They did a really beautiful job. We worked for a long time on this. I think it took almost a year because it was so and Rodrigo Mora was really the main principal curator who came up with wanting to use this piece as the symbol of the show. So it kind of goes back to, as I said, that penny, the circle, you don't realize what you've been doing, until you have to stop and look at, right? I mean, there's something, you go to school and then, you can't stop thinking about what you're doing, but before you get there, you just gotta do things, right? You're not really thinking about someone. And so there's a casualness, right? But then when you have to think about it, you have to talk about it, you have to speak about it, right? Then you have to get smart enough. Say, okay, so what am I doing really? And why does it matter so much, right? And sometimes it's okay to say, I don't really know. I'm not sure yet. It'll come to me, I'm sure, right? And it may take you years to figure it out. But there is something about creating language, or using numbers as a language that I wanted to push in this piece. So basically this piece has enough nails in it that it spells out circle, point, who, and each letter gets a number, right? Just like going back to my mother. And so there's this idea of using these methodologies to reconstruct something that's at once conceptual, but also very visual, right? And so I like the uncanniness of it. It sort of is speaking, and each side of this circle, which is actually a painting stretcher, has evokes the word, the inner, I think it's circle, the middle is point, and then the outer is hoop. So So I wanted to go back again to that circle, but also, I think this is the first painting I ever really looked at, and I didn't really know it was a painting, I just thought it was the title, it was like the cover of my mother's Bible. And when I really started to look at it, you know, this thing weighed about 300 pounds. And that's, my mother's a devout Catholic, so there was no way she was gonna be anywhere without that art. And so as a kid though, I was so fascinated because there were so many pictures. They were colorful. And when she wasn't around, I would take it out. But I realized years later, this is the painting, this is Raphael's painting, Madonna in the chair. And so there was a moment when I decided I would just focus in on this painting and my mother and create a whole show exhibition. So thank you, Raphael. But that idea, you know, that primary sources stay with you, they linger, whether you realize it. So I had to go flash into this because that's how this was arranged, thinking about that. This was the show, it was called Multi-Hyphenate, and this was the show that I had, a solo show at Monique Meloche Gallery in Chicago. And it was really the first time I actually devoured the wall and the color. I didn't want white, I wanted it to be like sunny yellow. And it was, I started to use the weather as the titles for the work. So whenever I finished the work, it became that, you know, whatever the weather was that day, that's what the title was. And I just wanted to do, I've never done this where I show you the up close, but these works were actually done in a residency in Arles. I had never been there, I had brought photographs of my mother, portraits of her to use because I also wanted to place her in a chair. She also is almost always photographed in a chair. And so I like that parallel, and so that's how this series started, and how the painting, so the drawing started and then they turned into painting. So these are all in UPenn, and they're all about 9 by 12. And this is one of the paintings, it's called Also Clear, that was the day. And again, it's using the same portraits. Okay, then there was another source of inspiration, that was this was earlier, so we're going back in time, so this is 2004. I used to love looking at the New York Times, the front cover, because the pictures. And for a long time, they were black and white, and then all of a sudden they became color. And this picture just kind of just did something to me. I could not forget about it. I cut it out, saved it. And there was something about the way the men are piled up there, way the waving is happening, there's kind of a celebration, right? It's the Iraqi, what was that, the Iraqi army, and it was a difficult time, so I did this painting. This was the turning point because I started to use public references, you know, as opposed to personal references. I like that this was in the world and that I can make a painting that came the world, so to speak. So again, I'm just really looking at, I love shape and the way color can grow out of that. It's just become a technique for me. I can't really say, I mean, with all certainty, yeah, this is the one, you know, but it was that photograph that really got me to this more compressed space. That was full of, yeah, something meaningful somehow. but it looks like an abstraction, right? But it's all comes from a living, like a photograph capturing something that has occurred in life, that is occurring. It's alive. And so for me, that's why I always say abstraction. It's kind of a weird word. But this whole discourse in painting, and in most things, abstraction versus figuration. I always feel like paintings, the best paintings are alive, and so they're sort of ambiguous. There's something about how the color works that push and pulls them apart and dismantles whatever they're putting up. And so I think that for me is truly what I live for, in a way where color takes hold. I'm proud to say that a lot of these have now been collected and they're in museums, and it's so nice to walk into a room. Because when you're painting and you're young and or you're in the studio for years and nobody pays attention, you're like, well, why am I doing this? Do I have enough places to store this? You just keep going, right? You just keep going because that's what you want to do. And I can't stress enough the courage that it takes to do that. It takes so much courage to do that. Especially if you're the only one in your family that does it. I also work on dinner napkins, Black dinner napkins, because they're fun and they're easy to take in a suitcase. But I have to say, I never used them as a kid. We never had dinner napkins. We only had, if we used napkins, they were paper. But there's this whole idea of the dinner napkin. It's meant to be wipe your lips off, So I just thought, wow, Black dinner napkins. So I love painting on them. I took them to scouting. I was in residence. I was a participant many years ago. It was 1981. And then I was asked to return last year. Was it that long ago, right? And I did frescoes. I did a fresco. Oh, I'm so excited. I don't have a picture of it, but frescoes, if you've never tried fresco, you should try it. It's amazing. Or just apply to scouting so you could just go to the fresco. So we keep moving back in time, and bubble gum. Anybody ever chew bubble gum? Bazooka bubble gum? I used to love bazooka bubble gum, blow these paint bubbles. My mother and father would be so upset. I think they banned us from chewing gum. But anyway, I wanted to use paint, and when I used paint, that was the word that came to me, bubble gum. I didn't like wearing pink dresses. I had one or two, but I like pink. And so I wanted to try something different with my painting. So for the first time, I had my drawings printed onto canvas that I primed. So I primed canvas, and then I had a printer enlarge one of my drawings and put it onto this canvas. And so that would be the beginning point. So it's another sort of stage in making, right? So I like that. So working for something that's already made and sort of reopening up that conversation into something into some other possibility. So that's why I'm showing you this one, because that was the first one. And then I had a big show. And the show was in Gablac, Los Angeles, my first show in LA. And this was during COVID when I really got into these. I mean, they had all been printed already. I had them for a long time before I actually reactivated them. So the drawing was printed on the canvas, right? And it was, they used special processes, and, then we layered it with matte medium. So then, and then maybe a year later, I started working. And it was during COVID when I was doing that. And at that time, I'd been living in Chicago, and I was so sad because, we were all worried. We didn't know what was going on. So a friend of mine shared a home with me in Michigan, and I stayed there for a month. And I fell all over the place and I bought a space that was so reasonable that I couldn't believe that city girl would even contemplate going to the strip. And so I have a space there, I have a very big space there, where I love to paint, and it's a pole barn. I didn't know what hell a pole barn was until I started talking to some of the artists up there. Like Tony Tassett and Judy Leatherwood, right, who had been living there with these and artists in Michigan. So I was leaving about 2 weeks. I had 2 weeks before I left, and I started to say, well, you should check out to see if there's a place that you could find here, because, you know, as a single woman, I was a little bit worried about my future. I was like, well, what happens in Mana? Because I was at Mana, you know, I had a studio at Mana, paying rent, it's a beautiful studio. So what happens when those things are no longer viable for me? And so, you know, I had to leave my studio, and so, you know, it was COVID. Like, what does that mean? So I kept thinking, well, as a woman, you know, on her own, how does she survive the future? So I felt, well, if I buy this barn with a house, it's a plan, I think and it was really reasonable and cheap. I said, well, then I could at least survive on my own and do what I love, which is paint, without having to go crazy. So that's what I did. And I still thought I was crazy, but I couldn't help it. It was so beautiful. It was such a different experience. You know, there's wild turkeys and there's deer and there's squirrels and everything else. And trees. And so everything, it was all what do you call it, turnkey. It was so easy. All I had to do was paint, put new lights, and it was already like a storage room for my work. So anyway, so that's where I did this, and it was the beginning, and it was COVID, and I was thinking a lot about this idea of palimpsest. And you know, the very medieval, I mean, that word goes back centuries, but this idea of not having enough material, right, to scribe, for the scribes to write. So they would reuse what they had, right? And so this idea of palimpsest was born. And so, like the historical tablet, right? And so I was thinking about these paintings like that, right? Where they started a long time ago. You know, there became this idea for a drawing, and then, well, first they might have started as a photograph, because I take pictures, a lot of pictures. When I was first starting out, I bought a camera. I was carrying a camera for years and taking snapshots, you know, when we went, the family traveled in Canada, wherever, you know, we took, you know, car trips, and, so the camera was always with me, and then I met Mr. Bay, and I gave him my camera, because I was like, I think you're better at this than I am, but, I've always loved her, always. And right now I just use an iPhone because it's really easy, right? So I take a lot of pictures, they're easy. And so, so this is how I started these. They were sort of overlapping of things that I loved and dissected. And so here I was painting. And I did enough paintings to spell out the word palimpsest. So each painting had a name that referred back to that word. So like savor and time, so it all added up to 10. And it was a very special time for me, and it's a very contemplative series. I still have a lot of them left. I put them out once, but there's something about them that I'm still holding on to. But anyway, Puerto Rico, we talked about the hurricane earlier. My sister and mother were in Puerto Rico when the hurricane happened, and for a lot of us, we had family there and living in the States. It was very traumatic. We could not locate our families. We had no access to communication. My mother, who's now today 95 years old, who was only a few years ago, she left shortly after, 3 months after that hurricane, she left. Well, actually, she came right after that when we found her. They came directly to Chicago, and she stayed in the United States since then. She's been too traumatized to go back and live there because of what. And it's sad, it's a very sad situation because it's an island and, you know, storm can come anytime. And the fortunate thing is the resources and who, you know, who cares, you know, I mean, the government wasn't so helpful, you know, I mean, our government was so helpful, you know, but moving forward, you know, the island has, you know, there's so many amazing artists and people that live there, just amazing, so many true, I mean, souls who just patriotic, you know, like just in their love of the island, you know, and their culture. And it's something that we all, those of us who are uh descendants or, you know, part of this culture is where it's sort of in us, you know, we will, it's something that never goes away. And so, but anyway, so I did this collage. My sister took the photographs and then I rewrote them. And that was just a little series. And then this all started another phase of my work, which I call air paintings. They were these, I got a commission for the city of Chicago, and I actually, it was a piece for Under the Wagon Bridge, which I'm sorry, I don't have a picture of. It was a very long piece and it was made out of this material for banners, which Chicago's really known for, right? A lot of their advertising on this band. And so it was banner material, and then I just used the samples that were not used, and then I started painting this during the same time. In the hurricane, we were searching, and so it was a good way to work. It was fast. I was pouring, I was scrubbing, I worked on the floor, on the wall. This was one that was sort of, it's not on the Michelle's collection, but a story gave this idea that every time a reporter went to the island, they would interview people, well, how are you? Well, what are you supposed to say? It's no idea, you know, I mean, so I was sort of critiquing that whole idea, you know, it's like, well, are we really okay? We're really not okay, but that's like how we hold ourselves, right, in place, you know, and, so that's how this came about. It was a great experience. This was my first show at Monique, and I love that she was really all into it, you know. It was the first painting show that I ever had, but there was nothing on the walls except for those collage pieces that I showed earlier. And here you can see how they were set up. There were I love seeing them all together. I had many different ideas for these. I love that you could see through them. And it would open up like another window. It was like a color wheel or a kaleidoscope. And so, yeah. So sometimes I refer to them as paintings with little feet. And maybe I'll do more in the future. I shall. But I love that they're double-sided. And yeah. So here, we're in 2017, and there was a big show in Chicago. Chicago is a very important place for me. It helped me really get grounded. I was teaching I got hired to teach at the School of Art in Chicago. I mean, over 20 years, you know, I never thought I'd be there that long, never thought I'd be, you know, I was probably the first, I was telling you, know, I think I was the first Puerto Rican professor. I mean, first art, you know, in the art department, right? And now the first probably emeritus professor. And so there's a lot of, you know, history and a lot of work, and a lot of communication and a lot of learning that happens. I love teaching because I love having conversations with other artists. It never ends, right? I mean, there's always a search, there's always an inquiry, there's always a question. And I'm thrilled that I just was able to continue doing this for my whole life, you know, and not really knowing at first what I was doing. And then every little step of the way, I got something else. Like it's almost like digest, you know, you get little like door opens, you know, there's a Cedar Arts project, and there's like, you know, you get this grant, and then you get this studio, right? And then you meet this friend, you know, right? And life is a series of steps. And so the show was like that. It was like a window into this life, you know. And you're like, wow, did I do all those paintings? And then the really cool part was that trim that's on the floor. One day I got this email from Condé Nast, very colorful. And I thought it was fake. That was before fake news got hit, the whole way. But I was just like, is that real? Is that from Ray? So I sent it to the curator, Terry Myers, who's a brilliant scholar and painting writer, was one of my colleagues, became chair of the painting department, and now he's retired, but lives in California, in LA. He said, yep, that's real. And so I curated some images to send to her, and she picked a few, and then she printed, the work was printed on some of her garments, mostly boys' shirts and the men's couture. So I was a little bit bummed that it wasn't a woman's. They were kind of long, they didn't fit me that. But I used I used the trim as a nod. And I love that it really made me think about painting as an amateur, almost that could be taken off of something, Like it could be the border in a drawing. And it was a way to hold this majestic space that is the Chicago Cultural Center, to hold it in place, right? Because you had all these images, like all these paintings, all this work, and how do you hold it together? So that whole architectural component was very important. How am I doing for time? Good, okay. So how do I get to these paintings? Well, I look at the floor. I look at, fabrics. The one on the right was taken from a fabric of all these palms, and it reminded me of Puerto Rico. So I wanted to recreate it, and I did. But what I did was, if you look really close in the middle of it, you see the shadow over the artwork. So that's what I said. Okay, I'm gonna put that painting and change it up, use it up. So you have to give yourselves permission to break your own rules, right? And so borrowing, what does that mean? How do we? We always borrow, right? We are always borrowing because we're always looking at things, right? There's no such thing as anything being original, some level. The only original thing is the way you reconstruct, or the way you dismantle, the way you organize, the way you sort things out, and the way you speak about it. So that's really the skill. It's like, how do I speak about this? I like hearing my son talk about his process. Like, that can sound like me talking about that, but you don't rub it in so much, right? But it's kind of curious how people learn, and how they're creatives, like how they organize things and how they deal with interruption and how do you listen for the breaks? Like if you're a music person, right? Or when you're the painter, how do you pause? Or if you're a sculptor, how do you begin to decide what gets placed where? What about material? I don't know, it's so open-ended now, that mediums are so open-ended that it's hard to say that this is what sculpture is today, like this is what painting is today. It's like this is what practice is today. It's probably better. So so looking at the floor in the culture center is fantastic. And there were like these rainbows coming in through my floor in the studio. And so I decided I put it up. So I wanted to make like a rainbow painting. I never did a painting like that. That was fun. And so also one of the first experiences that I had with painting was paint by numbers. And there was something about that little brush in my hand and following those shapes, and I think that I can never get rid of. So there you go. There's always a beginning somewhere. And I always wanted to be ballerina too, but I was too chubby. There's no way. There was something about that. So I blew it up. This was from an original that I did many years ago. And I decided I'd just make it really big. And I called it again, of course. Okay, so there are some really beautiful people in my life, and some have died recently, and so Solarwood was one of those souls who I was very fortunate to know. Not very, I'm trying to remember how we met. I think it was because we had a residency at the Addison Gallery in America already, so he happened to be having a huge show there. The most generous, caring person that I've ever met, generous artist, generous human being, and beautiful family. I think his daughter, one of his daughters is an artist. Now, so when he died, I mean, he was somebody who would send you little drawings in the mail, like postcards. He was just like that, and so we were doing something with him. Dali took a portrait of him, and he was never really comfortable with portraits, but Dali took a really beautiful portrait. And so we got to go to his house in Cheshire, it was in Connecticut. And I remember thinking, wow, he must have, you can only imagine what an artist studio is gonna look like, but his was like a little house with these, and it was like it wasn't huge, but he was doing those long wash drawings, so he had these gooseneck lamps that folded on. Very unpretentious studio, so I have all these beautiful thought waves with him, and but anyway, when he died, I had just moved into my studio at Manna Contemporary, which is fabulous space, studio space. I was unpacking, and I had plastic, and I had a canvas, and I got a letter from his wife, Carol, where we had exchanged. What we did was we exchanged. Because he was sending us these postcards, and I said, well, he doesn't ask for anything, and I said, well, I'm going to send him a drawing. Right. But what I did was I hand stitched drawing on black dinner napkin, that's what, and it was of his drawing, which was this album. And so, and he loved it, and he hung it up in his room, in a music room, and I never knew that until Carol sent me this note, post is that they listen to music room, blah, blah. But anyway, I was really sad, and that's why I made this painting. And so the drawing, it's the letter itself, I kind of wrote it out in my own handwriting. I arched it, and it's embedded in the ground of this painting. You can't really see it. And then on top of that, I wanted to make the drawing of the leaf that it was actually the view from his window in his studio. He had his studio was a little house with a big window that faced the forest. So that was it. And so, and I remember when I was in Michigan, I almost had tears in my eyes because my studio, it was a garage. I was a full bar, 2 garage doors. I decided I would take one of the doors out, face north. And it was all glass windows, and there was this moment when I looked out that window, and it was all trees that I flashed back to the studio. I was like, right? It's like, oh, life is really connected. It's very strange. But anyway, so this is a very special painting for me, and it was all about sharing and caring and being alive and working, making, right? And yeah, and being a human being, but not being a snob. And just be friendly and casual and generous. So I had another show, one of my first shows in Chicago. I'm so grateful to the Hyde Park Prison, where my son actually went as a kid to study how to make, to learn how to work with clay, right? So he made these little vessels. They have some of the best workshops for kids. And so that's how I became aware of Hyde Park Prison. And they have beautiful space there for exhibitions. Anyway, I got really lucky, and I had to show. It was my first, and I was very proud. And it was a catalog, and this was the painting the trim piece that I was referring to. Comme des Garçons also use this painting as part of their garments. And I just called it Best Friends Forever because it was part of it is I was using all kinds of things, but I was looking at paper for images, cartoons. I love using yellow here. Yellow's not something, it's not a very easy color to work with, and I've heard such crazy stories about yellow and how paintings, somebody just told me, yeah, paintings don't sell if they're yellow, and I was like, are you kidding? I think almost all the paintings I've sold have yellow. But there's this weird thing about colors, right? I mean, who cares color? You can make color work. It's just, it's what you decide to do. But there it is, there's moving up. And so Marry the Sky with Diamonds, actually the title came from my mother-in-law who passed, and she actually was buried with this fake diamond bracelet. I didn't have a title for this painting, and that's how it came to me. And so, but this is, I used to teach in Ireland, the Mellon School of Art, just for 2 weeks at a time. It was a residency that was set up with the artists too. I was one of the first faculty members to go, and I had never traveled to Ireland. And it was quite an experience, very beautiful, small college. People would come in from different places, very small program. But to be around that environment, there was stony fences, something about that place that was so grounded. The dirt was so rich, it was just interesting, so interesting, but. Yeah, so my paintings come from a lot of sources. That other one also came from drawings that I had made when I was there. And this is another one that I did while I was in the Fine Arts building. I did this studio. Fine Arts building is another really great place. Not too big of studios, but places where you go there. Have a long history. Looking at de Kooning, teaching at the Art Institute of Chicago, I was privy to going to the galleries every day. I would look at excavation all the time because it was on my way from the front of the building, the museum to the school entrance. And I had to create a piece that was based on. So I started with de Kooning's exhibition, and then I wanted to do Josephine Baker's body. So that's how this came to be. And so yeah, there are crazy sort of connections and combinations that I go for. I don't always know what they're gonna be, but I just trust something. It's not always clear. It's just what's in front of me, time. Or the things that I notice and put in front of me. So Blue Blue I Love You, it's like those old children's rhymes, that I kept thinking about in my head, like Yellow Yellow Kiss a Fellow. Blue 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 I Love You, there's another one. But this is a wacky one. I was looking at astrological charts. I think I was looking at Solowit's astrological chart. I don't even know how that happened. Or maybe not, maybe it was just a mix of things, like a Solowit piece I was looking at, and then my astrological chart, something like that. But anyway, it was a wonky painting, and it's just 48 by 48. I like it, it's kind of weird. And these are pretty big paintings, and using again all these sources. The one in the middle being the earliest, I think I have it here, yeah, High Ho Silver is on the left, Dahlia, which is actually based on a flower. A photograph of a flower that was sent to me by one of my earliest students who became a very dear friend later on, who lives in Iceland. Yeah, so you never know what's gonna spark a painting. And High Ho Silver, going back to those early TV shows, The Lone Ranger. And this one I actually wrote. I took my mother would write to me when I was at Yale, and she wrote this little note. So I took a little bit of it and put it into the middle page, the lower bottom part of the page. And that's the end.